Hello, my friends. First, here's the setup. A peace plan is being prepared by the Americans and the Russians, and enough details have leaked that we can already see the direction it's going. And that direction does not favor Ukraine. For Europe and for Kyiv, this is a brutal pill to swallow. Why? Because the framework being discussed looks a lot like the minimum terms Russia has repeated for years. Donbass effectively surrendered, limits on Ukrainian forces, and a neutrality status that blocks NATO membership. That is the core of the so-called 28-point plan. Now, notice the reaction. The European Union is pushing back hard. They're saying we can't accept any peace plan unless Kiev and Europe are at the table. Kaja Kallas is out front repeating the familiar lines about just peace and welcoming peace efforts. But let's be honest about what that signaling really means. Europe does not want a peace deal that locks in a Russian win. They want the opposite outcome. So when they say they welcome peace, but reject the only peace terms that are realistically on the table, that's not diplomacy, that's political theater. Here's conclusion number one. The United States knows this war is being lost. Washington wants out. Trump especially doesn't like paying for a losing project. He doesn't want to bankroll a dead end. So the U.S. position is shifting toward exit, even if it's messy, even if it looks like a climb down. Conclusion number two, Europe is waking up to a humiliating reality. They're not shaping the negotiations, they're being sidelined. Think about how absurd that is. Europe is now carrying a huge part of the financial burden because the U.S. is cutting support. Yet when the real negotiations happen, Europe isn't there. They get informed after the fact, but they still get the bill. That's the tragedy for them. And let me make a point people miss. In theory, Europe doesn't need to agree to a peace plan. This war ends when Russia, the U.S., and Ukraine agree. If Ukraine wanted to end the war quickly, it could decouple from Europe, stop taking the money, and make peace directly with Russia. Europe can be sidelined the moment Kyiv chooses a different path. But that brings us to the real reason the plan is being rejected right now. Ukraine's leadership and Europe's leadership both want to keep fighting, not because it benefits their people, but because it benefits their survival. Look at Kyiv. Zelensky and his circle are fully invested in this war. If peace happens on these terms, they don't just lose territory, they lose power. After years of hardline promises, propaganda, and corruption scandals, accepting defeat would mean political collapse. They know their unpopularity explodes the minute the fighting stops. So for them, prolonging the war isn't just policy, it's self-preservation. Some rumors even suggest personal danger for Zelensky if he concedes. Whether that's true or not, the incentive structure is clear. Peace equals the end of their regime. Now, look at Europe. If they accept this deal, it confirms something they cannot admit publicly, that their strategy failed. Leaders like Macron, Starmer, and others have tied their credibility to Ukraine will win. When your entire narrative is built on defeating Russia, you can't suddenly turn around and swallow a settlement that looks like Russian victory. For them, too, this is political survival. They can't change the story without destroying themselves. And that's why the values narrative is collapsing. The claim that Europe is fighting to defend democracy or defending Ukraine for moral reasons is wearing thin. What this conflict has really become by their own statements is a proxy war. Ukraine does the dying, Europe provides the money and weapons. The goal is to punish Russia, bog them down, and buy time for Europe to rearm. Listen to the reveals they've given us. Kaja Kallas openly talks about using frozen Russian assets to fund Ukraine. Legal issues be damned. She says it's to show Russia time is not on their side, even though Russia is advancing on the battlefield. And then she says the quiet part out loud. Wars are lost by whoever runs out of money or soldiers first. Translation: Europe supplies the money, Ukraine supplies the bodies. That's not solidarity. That's exploitation. Germany is a perfect example of this mentality. Chancellor Merz is urging Zelensky to stop young Ukrainian men from fleeing to Germany and send them back to fight. There are over 1 million Ukrainians in Germany, and Berlin is worried that these men will become a political trigger inside Germany, especially with AfD rising. So again, it's not how do we save Ukraine, it's how do we protect ourselves politically while Ukraine bleeds. And so when you strip away the slogans, four facts remain. Russia is winning the war. The U.S. understands that and wants out. The EU and Ukraine will reject the plan because they want to keep fighting. Their rejection doesn't change the end game. The victor dictates peace, and Russia holds the battlefield momentum. The longer this war drags on, the worse the final deal becomes for Europe and Ukraine. Every extra month adds more territory to Russia's leverage and more devastation to Ukraine's future. That's the reality underneath the collapsing masks. They are losing thousands and thousands of soldiers every week. The manpower situation is terrible, and the FAB bombs are getting better and better every single month. They are using more of them. They are using more strategic assets, and we can see disaster after disaster coming in. So every month, the line of the Ukrainian army is getting thinner and thinner and thinner, weaker and weaker and weaker. And from the military viewpoint, there is no risk for Russia. From the provocation point, from the SBU viewpoint, that is my concern. Let's start with the front line in Ukraine, because it is really collapsing. The neocons are still pushing forward for this proxy war, but at the same time, we are seeing reports that even Zelensky is now talking again about serious peace negotiations, especially after key areas have fallen and major pressure continues across the line. He is saying he's ready to put together new terms for peace in the hope that the Russians will listen. Here's my read. None of this should be surprising. It was obvious from the beginning, obvious since 2022, that this neocon globalist project to destroy Russia was going to fail. We all knew it. What happened is that the neocons and the globalists, especially in Europe and under Biden, decided they wanted to destroy Russia, period. They bet the farm. They bet everything they had, their reputation, their political future, everything on destroying Russia. They wanted to destroy Russia on the battlefield. They wanted to destroy the Russian economy. And their hope, their dream, was to destroy Russia as a state. Literally, they wanted to break Russia into 15, 16, 17 little republics and then put a puppet in Moscow, a color revolution, a puppet ruler like they imagined with Navalny. That was the fantasy they were selling to themselves. And remember, this war was about to end in March of 2022 inches, Istanbul, Turkey. There was a draft peace agreement, but it was Boris Johnson with Macron and Biden behind him who flew to Kyiv to persuade Zelensky, don't sign peace. We're going to give you billions and billions and billions of dollars, an infinite amount of money and weapons until you defeat Russia. They wanted to use Ukrainians inside a meat grinder cannon fodder to break Russia, and Zelensky agreed, but it failed. And here's why it failed. The main flaw in neocon thinking was this. They treated this war as optional for Russia. Like Vietnam was optional for the United States. If things go well, stay. If they get too costly, pack your bags and go home. That's how Washington handled Vietnam. But this is not optional for Russia. This is existential, a critical must-win-at-all-costs war for Russia. The entire future of Russia, the existence of Russia, depends on it. So the neocons assumed Russia would de-escalate the moment costs rose. No, Russia will not de-escalate. That was the problem in 2022, and that is the problem they have now. They bet everything in 2022, and now they're watching the grand project fail. And let's be honest, Macron, Starmer, the German hardliners, they don't want peace. They want to keep using Zelensky as a puppet. They want Russia to surrender, abandon its position, and let Ukraine become a full NATO puppet. That will never happen. Now about Zelensky's new peace plan. People act like this is a real pivot. I don't see it that way. I don't believe Zelensky wants peace at all. I believe it's propaganda. Every few months he comes out with another peace proposal, and it's always the same. Russia must surrender. Russia must pay some insane price. Ukraine must become a NATO-aligned state. It's an impossible wish list, but it plays well in uneducated Western ears. Zelensky wants peace. Putin refuses. That's the whole script. Look at the contradiction. Just yesterday, Zelensky was in France with hardline European leaders pushing for hundreds of jets, hundreds of missiles, fighting to the end, whatever it takes. Those planes and missiles will never arrive in time, and whatever arrives will be destroyed. Yet they keep the propaganda alive. We are winning, Russia will surrender. So every few weeks, Zelensky announces peace proposals that are not peace proposals at all. They are public relations tools meant to keep the Western coalition glued together and keep the illusion alive in the press. At the same time, we've had corruption scandals coming out of Ukraine, hundreds of millions disappearing. People close to Zelensky are being targeted by anti-corruption agencies. Some want to interpret this as Trump pressuring Zelensky to accept reality. Maybe some people inside the Trump administration want to use this scandal to get tougher. But overall, I still think Zelensky's peace talk posture is theater. And while we're on Trump, I'll be blunt. Many Americans, including myself, had hoped that Trump would end this disaster quickly. When Zelensky was kicked out of the White House back in February, it looked like the beginning of the end. But that's not what happened. Trump has been leaning more and more toward the neocon establishment wing, Lindsey Graham, Cotton, Ted Cruz, people who don't understand the war, but who push the same old ideology. We're now seeing threats toward India and China, secondary sanctions, all of that. There is a clear economic angle. Trump wants to sell American energy, take market share, and use sanctions as leverage. I understand the incentive, but strategically, it drags out a war that could have ended months ago if Washington cut intelligence and weapons. Europe cannot sustain this proxy war alone forever. Now, back to the battlefield reality. People predicted this collapse for years. Think back, summer 2022, big Ukrainian counteroffensive. 2023, Zaporizhia counteroffensive. Summer 2024, Kursk offensive, basically a suicide mission. Summer 2025, almost nothing left for Ukraine to even attempt. And now, right before winter, the front line is cracking everywhere. From a purely military viewpoint, there is no hope for Ukraine's defense. Many analysts have said this for years. This is existential for Russia. Russia is using all resources, reshaping the army, reshaping doctrine, increasing military production. When Russia entered this war in 2022, after years of provocations, after the fake Minsk agreements, after NATO baiting and poking the bear, Russia did not want a long war. Putin wanted a short war and a negotiated settlement. Ukraine is a neutral buffer, no NATO puppet state on Russia's border, and security for Russian-speaking populations in the east and south. Those were simple demands. But Boris Johnson, Biden, Macron forced Russia into a long war because they believed this was their golden chance to destroy Russia first, then focus on China later. That was the master plan. Yet Russia had manpower advantage, technology advantage, and above all, the existential motivation. Russia has increased FAB glide bombs dramatically. They've expanded artillery. They're recruiting roughly 30,000 volunteers every single month. They're rebuilding the war machine to fight long. Ukraine cannot match that. So militarily, Ukraine is done. The only danger I see is not traditional military risk. I see provocation risk, the SBU risk. In desperation, Zelensky and the neocon backers may try something wild inside Russia. Assassination of a high-ranking Russian officer, a minister, a bombing in Moscow, even a strike on a nuclear facility. The purpose would be to provoke a massive Russian response. Then Zelensky cries wolf and tries to drag NATO directly in. That is the escalation trap. That's the only real strategic risk I'm watching. And we've already seen attempts heading in that direction, high-profile bombing attempts, targeted attacks, terror-style operations. That's what desperation looks like when you're losing. Now, the discussion in that conversation pivoted to Latin America, Venezuela, Mexico, broader regime change patterns. So let me keep that thread in the same analysis because it matters for understanding the wider strategic posture being described. On Venezuela, the U.S. does not have the forces to invade and occupy Venezuela with 18,000 troops. That's not remotely enough for a country that large and geographically complex. To invade Venezuela, the U.S. would need something like Iraq, 2,000 and 300s of thousands of troops. With 18,000, you might seize a port or a small coastal area. You don't occupy a nation. So what is the fleet for? Not drugs, not cartels. That's the smokescreen. The fleet exists to make sure a coup attempt succeeds regime change. The raised bounty on Maduro is a signal. The idea is to incite generals, support a legal political rupture, and have overwhelming strike capabilities sitting offshore to guarantee victory. Strategically, the narrative pins this heavily on Marco Rubio. The claim is that Rubio, as Secretary of State, is driving a promise he made to Miami exile communities: remove Maduro. And there's a domestic U.S. political layer in that story, too. The idea that a Venezuela regime change win could matter for a 2028 ticket. Whether or not you buy every detail, that is the logic chain being argued. Then there's the resource story. Chevron accounts for a quarter of Venezuelan output. The U.S. is a top trade partner, so why push harder? The line in the transcript says ideological plus economic, with Rubio more ideological and Trump being sold on the economic upside of a compliant Caracas. The analysis then continues. If a coup succeeds, you'd see a chaotic transition, purges of loyalists, exile flows, a restacking of the state, and a new leadership aligned to Washington. The anti-narcotics framing is described as legal cover for force, not the real driver. The real driver is regime change plus resource leverage. The transcript argues the U.S. is unlikely to attempt a full-blown Ukraine-style color revolution in Mexico because Washington wants stability there, but will use pressure tactics to extract concessions on cartels, migration, and alignment. It frames U.S. policy as a honey or vinegar approach: incentives when cooperation works, harsher pressure when it doesn't. The idea is not to overthrow Mexico's government outright, but to push it into compliance on Washington's priority list. So that's the full arc. Let me close where I began, because nothing in the bigger picture changes the core war reality in Ukraine. Militarily, Ukraine is losing thousands every week. Manpower is collapsing. Russian strike capacity is improving month by month, and the Ukrainian line is thinning continuously. The only meaningful risk now is not whether Russia wins, but whether desperate actors try a provocation large enough to widen the war. That's the danger zone. Everything else is already decided by the battlefield trajectory. Eastern Europe is turning into a crucible again, and what just happened is not a routine extension of the Ukraine war, but a dangerous, calculated shift that drags the shadow war onto NATO soil. I'm Larry C. Johnson, and when I look at the deliberate railway sabotage on the Warsaw-Lublin supply artery and the Russian drone strike that set an LPG tanker ablaze right next to Romania's border on the 16th of November 2025, I see a single strategy expressed in two moves. First, a strike on logistics, then a strike on psychology, both aimed at NATO's resolve. The blast in Poland wasn't random. It was a message, a kinetic act deep inside alliance territory, targeting the lifeline that fuels Ukraine's war effort, using proxies to blur attribution and slow response, because hybrid warfare only works when democracies argue over thresholds. And the near miss in Romania, forcing evacuations of civilians along the Danube, shows Moscow is willing to push risk to the limit without formally triggering Article 5, because the goal isn't just to damage port infrastructure, it's to make the backline feel like a front line, to plant fear in border societies, to raise domestic political costs, and to test how far the alliance can be stretched before it snaps. These aren't isolated incidents. They are calibrated probes in a gray zone campaign designed to disrupt aid flows, intimidate frontline NATO states, and exploit hesitation, especially at a moment when leaked peace frameworks and quiet negotiations are swirling, because Russia wants to harden its leverage while forcing the West to calculate whether continued support is worth the growing price at home. NATO's dilemma is obvious: respond softly and invite more probes, respond hard and risk escalation. So the path forward has to be simultaneous and systemic. Harden critical arteries like rail lines and Danube ports as if they are frontline assets. Shorten the attribution cycle so response happens in days, not months. And make gray zone attacks expensive through relentless counterintelligence, infrastructure defense, and clear rules of engagement for airspace violations. If the alliance keeps describing sabotage and incursions as unfortunate events, it will keep being surprised by the next one, because the pattern is already visible and the doctrine is lagging reality. And unless NATO adapts now, adaptation will be forced later by a bigger escalation. The core truth is this: Russia is not acting chaotically. It is acting rationally inside a strategy to fracture Western unity by making the war feel present inside Europe itself. And the only real question left is whether NATO chooses to recognize the new battlefield before the battlefield chooses for them.